this evening, we're starting a new book. It's up on the screen. Book of Esther. So if you guys would, grab your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Esther. Esther is a book that it's placed in the same time period of Ezra. So it's a contemporary of Ezra and Nehemiah. You guys probably already know this. One of the commentaries I went through said they guesstimated that it took place between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. And so it's kind of smack in the middle of this. This is the third of the three post-exilic books that we are going through here. I mean, it's the last one of them. I don't know if you guys noticed this or not. The next book following the book of Ezra is Job. It's for the young men. Get a job. Actually, it's Job, right? So it's Job, and I'm not sure. I told my wife, I said, you know what's coming after Ezra? If you guys know me and my wife, every time I read through Job in my yearly reading plan, I don't know what it is. I try not to tell her, but she goes, stuff's going wrong. Are you in Job? And I'm like, yeah, maybe. Why do you ask? But anyways, I'm not sure if we're going to hit that right after this. Job is sort of considered one of the poetic books of the Old Testament. Job, Psalms, Proverbs. So there's a few of them in there that we might kind of set aside until later and skip over to the prophets. We'll see. But right now, we're in Esther, which is in the time of Ezra. I'm not that far off. This could be an interesting evening. And so Ezra and Nehemiah dealt with the people that came out of Babylon, out of Persia, out of the captivity, back to Jerusalem. Ezra dealt with the building of the temple and the altar, and Nehemiah with rebuilding the wall and the houses and some of those things, but getting things back into order. And Esther is kind of the opposite. Esther deals with the people that stayed in Babylon or Persia. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar got conquered by the Persian kings. Started with, you guys remember what king it started with in Ezra? Cyrus was the king that it started with. And so this is where we're picking up. We're in this time, and we're going to see here just shortly in a minute after I get through the introduction who the king is. But so this is the people that stayed in the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's an interesting historical account. It's an account of the protection, the provision, and the providence of God to spare a nation that remained in Babylon and the main theme, you probably already know this, but the main theme is that there was a bad guy, an evil character, who wanted to wipe out all of the Jewish people that were there at the time. And so it's God's hand in and provision and protection in the lives of the nation that the Messiah was going to come through, that was dwelling there at the time. So when we look at it, we're going to see God's all over the book. However, you probably know this as well, God's name is not mentioned one time throughout the whole of the book. So, interesting. His name isn't mentioned. In fact, when we look at this, neither is prayer or fasting or worship or offerings or prophecy or the book of the law. We just went through Nehemiah. All of those things were listed. The people fasting, crying out in sackcloth and ashes, reading the word over and over, changing and adjusting their life according to the word. None of that stuff is in this book. So it's an interesting section of Scripture, and the way it's written, though we don't know who the author is, there's an invitation for us sort of anonymously by the author to look for God's hand throughout the account. And when we look, you don't even have to look that closely. It's obvious that all of these coinkydinks, right? The coincidences aren't coincidences. They're provisions. And we see this. There's these perfect provisions of God. And also we're going to see a couple of huge, I don't know what you call it, like reversals or toppling of plans and falling completely the opposite in the other way. So we see throughout over and over, and the author is kind of just wooing us to just see God throughout the whole thing. And it's kind of one of those books you look back and you go, man, hindsight's 2020. So often things like that in our life happen where we don't know what's going on. Why is all this happening? And we look back and go, whoa, God's hand was there through the whole thing. He spared me. In fact, He gave me favor that I didn't deserve. And so we're going to see that over and over here throughout this book. We're going to see His presence and His purpose behind the scene. All of a sudden, I got a flashback to an old movie I haven't seen in a really long time. The guy behind the curtain with the wheels. Pay no attention to the man behind. I mean, God's back there doing and orchestrating all this stuff, but He's not turning wheels and He's not behind a curtain. But He's the God of the universe. So, the whole span of the book is about 12 years long. It goes through about 12 years of history. And we're going to see as we go through the first 2 chapters this evening, there's a span of 4 years that we're going to look at. And really the first 2 chapters, they just kind of set the scene for the main plot. So it gives us not quite all the main characters. There's one character we're going to get introduced to in chapter 3. We're not going to see tonight, but it introduces a bunch of the main characters, and so I guess let us go ahead and check it out. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Assuras, This was the Assuras who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Assuras sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, and there's something for us to take note of, the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and his servants. The powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. So here we have the introduction, sort of. The first person we're introduced to is Assuras, who was also known as Xerxes. Ahasuerus was the grandson, of Cyrus, who was the guy who sent Ezra. We just looked at that, and he was the son of Darius, or Darius, however you want to say it. And he was succeeded by Artaxerxes I, who was the king that, if you remember, sent who? Nehemiah, right? So it's right here in the middle of this time that we've already been in and been looking at. So he was the one who gave all the blessings and the provision. That was the guy who followed him, Artaxerxes I. So this is the like I said already, man, that's kind of a hard one for me tonight, Medo-Persian Empire. It's the second kingdom mentioned by Daniel. You guys remember in the book of Daniel when Nebuchadnezzar had a crazy dream and he needed somebody to give him the interpretation, and he said, not only are you going to give me the interpretation, I'm not going to tell you the dream, you have to tell me. Anyways, it was an interesting scene, but there was an image that was revealed to Daniel. It was a statue, and the statue had a bunch of different things. It had a gold head, it had shoulders and arms of silver, like a torso, and then it had bronze waist and thighs, and it had legs of the shins of iron, and then it had the feet mixed with iron and clay. You guys remember that? So this Medo-Persian Empire was the second phase. The first one, if you guys remember, was Babylon, which Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was the head of gold. Then where we're at in the prophetic timeline is the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the third one was Greece. The fourth one was Rome. And then the last one, the clay and the iron feet, well, we kind of have yet to see. It's either the European Union or some of the strong and weak governments that are going to be in place in the end times. And then a rock comes and hits the clay and iron feet, and the rock is, well, we sang about him tonight. The rock won't move. It's Jesus. And so it's a prophetic picture. But right now, in Esther, we are in the Medo-Persian Empire, and as we just read, the empire is huge. It's the biggest kingdom up to date. It is a very, very wealthy empire, the largest and most wealthy empire of the time. It spanned from India to Ethiopia, and we saw there was 127 provinces. He is over. And so, I mean, a part of that whole thing is how he gets his wealth, right? Because any good king is going to tax people. And so he's got all sort of income coming from all over the place into this. And so he was, it says there, he was at Shushan. And you remember, I don't know if you remember, but I think it was one of the last two books. I think it was Ezra, but Shushan was the place, the winter place. It was in the desert. It was a place that they would go in the winter because the weather was fair. So it's kind of like, and again, I remember last time I mentioned this, Frank wasn't here, and I know Frank's back to Phoenix again, but it's kind of what Frank does. He likes to come up to Payson in the summer and have the heat up here and go down to Phoenix in the winter and have the nice warm winters. But from what I gather, this was known as a place like similar to Phoenix, right? So people would go out in the morning and crack an egg on the asphalt and cook it right out there. It's that hot in the summer. So it's that kind of thing. Or, I don't know, can you bake a loaf of bread in the car? I don't know what all you can do with the heat in Phoenix, but it's definitely hot. Try to avoid it is what we do, us Paysonians, right? So either way, it was a place, though, that was nice in the winter, and so this is where he's at in the winter, in this season. And just kind of some free information, this Shushan, this Persian kingdom, this palace, if you will, that he was living in, has been unearthed in archaeology. This is a place that is a real place, and you can check it out. And also the tomb of King Xerxes. But I have a picture. Dustin, can you give me so this is the citadel. This is the foundation. This is the base of this city. And there's some numbers on there. And the first number 1, I don't know if you can see it. It's just kind of way up towards the top. Is the courtyard of the garden. Number 2 on there is the courtyard of the house of the women, which is kind of an interesting one. You go, what's that about? We're going to get to that in the historical account. Number 3 is the second courtyard, or one of the 2 outer courtyards. Number 4 is an inner courtyard, and number 5 is the throne room. And so we're going to see a lot of these places in the historical account of Esther as we go through. But there's quite a bit of secular history about this king, about this kingdom. You can go ahead and go to the next one. And the next one is the tomb. Actually, there's 4 of the tombs. I didn't dig all the way in to see if it's the 4 that we just looked at, but I know that the one to the far right, I shouldn't say I know, I strongly believe during my research that the one to the far right is the tomb of Xerxes. But that's a pretty crazy tomb, just saying. I don't know how you get him up in there, but maybe they had some catapults or something. But that's his tomb. And there's quite a bit of history about this kingdom. Xerxes was a warrior. His father, I believe it was Darius, and you can go back to the title one or whichever slide you want to. Actually, go back to the last one, the one that shows that. Yeah, just leave it right there. But Darius was, his father was a guy that was known to, he went up against Greece and tried to take Greece out, and Greece stopped him and shut him down. And we're going to see a little bit later on, it doesn't have the account, but Xerxes was a guy who went up against Greece again. I don't know if it was to defend his father's pride or what, but he goes up against him again. He was recorded in history, secular history, as a big guy, a tall guy, was rather strong and good looking with a beard. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, that came out. It's not in my notes. Didn't look like me. That's obvious. But anyways, tall guy, strong guy. And so anyways, let's read verse 4. We got to get back to the Bible. So when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So he has a party, invites the leaders from all 127 provinces to come. And so he has a huge party in his place. And it was a very, very long party in order, it says there in verse 4, to show the excellency of his majesty. So he was a real humble guy as well. Wanted to show off all of his stuff. And that was about 5 months, a 5-month shindig. That's pretty crazy. I didn't pull it up, but I remember back to Cyrus. There's an account, I believe, in Ezra where Cyrus, they go through and they show how much daily portions and cattle he would slaughter to feed his servants and to feed his household, and sheep and lambs and deer and all kinds of stuff that he would use to eat. And I just think of a party with this many people for 5 months, absolutely crazy, but he's kind of showing his power and showing off his kingdom. And it goes into more detail here in verse 5. It says that when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with the royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. And in accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. So they have this huge party, very extravagant. The palace was amazing. It had these huge pieces of fabric hanging. In my mind, I'm thinking between the pillars, they got these strands of cord, linen cord that's fastened together, these purple and blue curtains and white curtains, and just sort of like to make dividers between different portions of the party or whatever was going on in different rooms in the palace. And just everything was extravagant. The couches were gold. I don't know if they were comfortable, but they were gold. I thought it was kind of interesting, right? They served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other. So it's like they just have so much money that every cup's custom and it's different. You never drink out of a cup that the guy standing next to you's got the exact same one. I think back to my childhood, and I feel like all my kid cups were all different too, but it's a different reason. It's like, I guess if you're really rich, you get all different cups, and if you don't have a lot, you get all different cups. For some reason, I remember this Flintstone cup. It was the dinosaur. What was it? It was a Dino? Yeah, it was a Dino cup, and it was his head. And it was my favorite cup, and I don't have it anymore. So, sad story. I don't know why. That's just in my head. So, anyways, they had all these different cups. I guess it was great. They were made out of gold. Everything was in abundance. And then it's kind of interesting in verse 8. Just kind of has to throw it in there. And it was an all-inclusive thing, right? They could drink as much as they wanted. There was no like cap or, Also, you didn't have to drink anything. I mean, some of those kind of parties they had, every time a round came out, you drank it whether you wanted to or not. Otherwise, you'd offend the king, and you probably wouldn't make it out of the party. So, but they didn't have any of that. It just was each man would drink according to their pleasure, but according to, I don't know about this kind of party. The parties I've been to, they probably drank a lot. Just saying. Just so you know, that was a long time ago. I'm not doing any of those things anymore. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Assuras. So as the men are being entertained by the king, Queen Vashti entertained the women. This is just kind of something that, it's just a note of something that happened. It's a little bit unique. A lot of times in those kind of big parties, they wouldn't separate men and women. For some reason, queen's like, ladies, let's go have ladies' night. And so they had their own place They had their own feast, and the queen was entertaining them. So verse 10, on the seventh day, which was the last day of the after party that he had, the week of after party, basically, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abgatha, Zethar, and Carcass. He was really, really gone, I guess. Carcass. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Assuras, verse 11, to bring the queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So we have Vashti in this scene, which is a pretty interesting scene. We're not exactly sure what it was that provoked or encouraged the king to summon his wife. There's a few different Jewish historians that sort of make guesses throughout the history of what was going on. But we do know that one thing that he had going for him was that he was merry with wine, which basically that's just an Old Testament way of saying he was verschnickered. So he was drunk. And so for whatever reason, it happened, he called his wife up. We can be sure of one thing: his judgment was impaired, right? He's been drinking, and he's just doing stuff with a lack of wisdom, which is also known as drunkenness. So, Jewish tradition says that the men in this party were arguing about whose wife was more beautiful, and so the king wanted to settle the issue, and he summoned his wife. Again, that's just Jewish tradition. We don't know that is what happened. But really, there's a couple of more notes I wanted to give. There seems to be no reason from the text, from the language in the text, to indicate that the king was asking his wife to show up in a provocative way. Though Jewish tradition says that's exactly what was happening. He was asking his king to show up immodestly. And that those motives were there. Again, we can't get it from the text. Jewish tradition, they might have embellished the Jewish people sometimes. I mean, all people sometimes. But you go fishing with somebody and you'll hear the story. But one commentary said it could have had to do with her coming out to be seen. And in that culture, they would cover their faces as sort of a sign of being chaste. And so he wanted to parade her, and that's really what one of the clear things is from the text, is that the king seemed to be seeking to show her off, kind of as he did with his whole palace and all of the extravagant food and all of the wine, just kind of that he wanted to show her off as a possession, something that was to be owned or an accomplishment. And so that's kind of the first note there. That the other one is, again, whatever the circumstances were, the queen wasn't about to comply before a group of drunken men. So that would imply that whatever it was, in her mind, it was a step down, it was degrading, and she didn't want to come out. So it wasn't the idea of her just being obstinate because she wanted to be obstinate for the sake of being stubborn, but that really there was morally some reason that she decided, you know what, I'm not going to do it. Tell him I'm not coming out. Which I have to say is pretty admirable for this queen in the face of all that could potentially happen to her, which of course, probably the quickest, easiest thing could have been she was killed instantly. But she had to stand in the face of fear and say no. One of the commentaries I went through noted this, that too often women, and this is just an observation from him, too often women put themselves in dangerous places, especially when alcohol is involved. Not that a man who takes advantage of a drunk woman isn't at fault, but that a woman could have avoided the whole situation by saying no and excluding herself from that sort of gathering altogether. But she said no. No to being used for her beauty. Which sort of brings up another idea, another thought, and that is this. And somebody, maybe you did have this thought, maybe you didn't, but some of you might be thinking, well, she's being disobedient to her husband, saying no. Not just that he's a king, but he's a husband. Doesn't the Bible say that wives are to submit to their husbands? The answer is yes, the Bible does say that wives are to submit to their husbands, but it does not mean that a wife is to submit to her husband if he is asking her to sin or if he's commanding her to sin in this kind of situation. It is clear biblically that there is instruction for us to submit to those over us on many levels, that we're to respect and honor and obey authority from the household to the workplace to the government. But throughout the Bible, there is a greater obligation to honor and obey God than to do something ungodly or to do something that would have us compromise our morality before the Lord. So, kind of like Queen Vashti here, we're not to abstain for the sake of being obstinate. And that's funny because you kind of get that attitude today in our culture concerning some of the governmental things. Like, they don't even know what they're doing. I'm not going to do anything they say, which is not the attitude to have. But when there needs to be a stand taken for biblical truth, to serve God, to submit to God over man, like Peter said. Peter said, you choose whether it's right for me to obey God or man. But he obeyed the Lord. When there needs to be a stand taken, it does need to be done. And in this case, I look to her and I think, man, may we be so bold as Queen Vashti in the face of whatever kind of pressure or temptation to say no to things that we should say no to. Or vice versa, to say yes to things that we should say yes to, especially when we know, even though it's hard, it would be pleasing and honoring to God. I think we're going to have more opportunities in our future to do things like this, to take these kind of stands. And, I just think of some of the pastors that I have seen already take these kind of stands. The pastor of Calvary Chapel in, it just slipped right out of my brain. Doggone. Anyways, it's one of Don McClure's sons up there in Northern California who was it Chino Hills? San Jose, that's the one. San Jose, where he was being sued by the government over and over and over. Every time they showed up for a meeting, they'd put another document on the window, and they just left all the documents all over the window that they were being fined or whatever it was. So the last time I even checked, which I should probably check on him again, but the last time I checked, he had like $5 million worth of fines for a meeting, and it was a necessary stand toward the government to see, and he went to court for it. He gave his testimony at the pastors' conference last year that he stood before the court and the judge and said, guys, it's not about trying to offend people or stand against the government. I'm called to be a shepherd to sheep that are hurting and confused and going through difficult things, and I'm going to keep my doors open and I'm going to love them. And then the judge was like, I'm not a Christian, but I admire your stand. I'm like, yes, amen. That we would stand for things of God when it's time to stand for things of God. So, good on you, Queen Vashti. I wouldn't do it either. Even though I'd probably want to kick him in the shin. Drunken king. But anyways, verse 13. So the king said now to the wise men, he goes to get some counsel, who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice. Verse 14. Those closest to him, being Karshena, there we go, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, that guy, Mares, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence. and who ranked highest in the kingdom. So he brings the top leaders in the kingdom in, verse 15. And he says, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, or according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Assuras brought to her by the eunuchs? And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all of the princes and all the people who are in the provinces of King Assuras, or Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. So basically, they're scared. Could be a feminist movement start. And when they reported, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. And then, verse 18, this very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered. Really quickly, before I forget, that line right there, being recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered. I believe it was Darius with Daniel who made the decree. He was tricked into making the decree about anybody worshiping anyone else, and ended up having to throw Daniel into the lion's den, even though he didn't want to, because he made it into a decree of the law of the Persians and the Medes. This is the same thing. It's going to be law. It's going to be unchangeable. And so that's what they're trying to get him to do. And then we're back there into verse 19 in the middle, that Vashti shall come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she, when the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great. All the wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And then he sent leaders to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. So the king listens to this guy, Memucan, who seems to me to be a little bit scared of Mrs. Memucan, right? But man, he's thinking, if the wives get wind of this, I'm in trouble. So, king, this is what we got to do. We got to send a letter out to everybody. Wives need to submit to the husbands. And one commentary I went through, only one of them brought this up. The idea of, instead of honoring the dignity of his wife. And for a minute, it took me a minute to think, yeah, this is an option. He could have said, you know what, I was drunk last night, or whatever the case is, and I asked my wife to do something dumb, and I'm not going to make this law. She's an honorable woman. But he didn't do that. Instead, he kind of gave in to the pressures of these guys, and they all got together and ended up being scared of the women, of the land. And of course, I'm kind of being tongue-in-cheek there. And he ended up putting Princess Vashti out and listening to them. And then throwing there at the very end that the women should respect their wives. I'm sorry, I said that totally wrong. That the wives should respect the men, the husbands. I got to be clear, especially in this day and age. So, I just heard on my news briefing this morning, I can't remember which newspaper covered it, but now I'm getting two stories confused. Anyways, there was an article, and the picture on the front was of a pregnant man sitting on the couch. And of course, it's just not a thing. So anyways, just so you know, if you got a little bit confused, all of the people that are pregnant are women. Okay, back to the story. So, Okay, the master, no, wait a minute. Where's that verse that I was at? There it is, verse 20. The king's decree, which he make, is promoted throughout all of his empire, for it is great that all wives honor their husbands, both great and small. So making a decree, just so you know, putting your foot down, making a decree in your home to have respect and honor from your wife is not the right way to go about having a marriage. And when I think about this, Paul's instruction to wives in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33 was summed up like this: let the wife see that she respects her husband. And it kind of brings this thought to mind. A wife's respect is the most precious gift that she can give to her husband. However, the means used here in Esther to gain and preserve this respect was foolish. A man cannot demand or coerce respect from his wife. If it isn't freely given, then it isn't worth anything. And I like that. It's a good saying there. So, chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Assuras subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. So you think to yourself, after these things he remembered, what? That doesn't quite fit right there, because it seems like he just said it. So we got to kind of look. And really quickly, history tells us that this is that period of time, this 4-year period between the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, that Xerxes went to war to try to overtake Greece and was defeated. Historically, the account says that he was defeated by Leonidas and the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. So this is that account in history when Xerxes and the Persians went up against Greece. And if you look down to verse 16, we see that this scene takes place in verse 16 in the 7th year, and that's where we get the 4 years, because back at the beginning of chapter 3, it's talking about his 3rd year. Then between the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, now it's the 7th year of his reign. So 4 years have passed. He went to war against Greece. He was defeated. And so now we kind of see, after the wrath of the king subsided, and he probably needed something to distract his mind of being defeated, he remembered Vashti, and he decided to make himself better or distract himself with a fashion show. Basically, is what's going on. It's not really a fashion show. It's more like Miss Universe Persia, basically, in order to get a new wife. So let's check it out. Verse 2, it says there, then the king's servants who attended him had this idea, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all of the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given to them. And then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And Kish had been carried away captive from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So at that time, when they captured the Judah and Jerusalem, his grandpa was there. And verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, it's her Hebrew name, Hadassah. Esther, it's her Persian name, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. And the young woman was lovely and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So we get some more information, a couple of more main characters into the scene. Mordecai and Esther, and we get some information of how they ended up there in Babylon or in Persia. As Mordecai's it was his great-grandfather who was taken captive from Jerusalem. So we're not sure if there was little baby Mordecai in diapers going into captivity or if he wasn't even born yet. But either way, we find out Esther's parents both died. And so Mordecai, which was really just an older cousin of hers, had brought her up. So the one who had given her an upbringing was Mordecai, took her as his own daughter. And so we also have the note there in verse 7 that she was lovely and beautiful. It's kind of interesting when you look at those words. Lovely more has the idea of basically beautiful to behold, beautiful to look at, and then very beautiful also, it has the idea more of like inside, both though, but also more of her character. So basically, Esther is beautiful inside and out. So just an awesome gal. Verse 8, and so it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young women pleased him, and she obtained his favor. And so he readily gave beauty preparations to her beside her allowance, and then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. And he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. So this is just one of those places where you look at it, you see the scene beginning to play out, and what you see is one of those coincidences, or a couple of those coincidences, that Hegai, the king's man in charge of these young women, favored Esther, took care of her above everybody else, gave her the best house, gave her 7 servants. And so it's kind of crazy. I don't know why this popped into my head. I've never really watched the show, but I thought maybe it's kind of like The Bachelor, right? Only according to Jewish tradition, it's times 400 bachelorettes, eligible women. And that's what the Jewish tradition says. They think there was about 400 virgins that were brought for the king to check out, I guess. So it's kind of a big old mess. Would have been great for TV, I guess. I don't know. Verse 10. Esther had not revealed her people or her family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai placed in front of the court of the women's quarters, paced in front of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So this is, to me, is a sweet little couple of verses that give us a little bit of insight into the fatherly-daughterly relationship, the character of Mordecai, and Esther as well. As we see here, and this won't be the last time, but Esther listens to her, I call him Uncle Cousin, because that's really who he was. I got one of those, Uncle Cousin Pete. But Esther listened to Mordecai. She respected his wisdom. She withheld information. Well, I mean, I don't know if it necessarily was asked of her, but she didn't tell them who her people were, her family were, that she was Jewish. She just went in and went along with what was going on. And also, every day Mordecai was down there in the court, pacing back and forth, waiting to hear what was happening with Esther. I could just see him wringing his hands, just worrying, walking back and forth, wondering how she's doing, probably praying. It doesn't mention that. That's just my insight. But here we have this going on. And just kind of, to me, an awesome picture of just this love going on. Verse 12, it says, each young woman's turn came to go into King Assuras after she had completed 12 months preparation. And you thought your wife took a long time getting ready. 12 months preparation according to the regulations for the women. I guess there was a law. We can't go out looking like this. I'll give you another year. Get it together. 12-month preparation. Pretty crazy. Good thing my wife's home tonight because I'll probably get a tomato. But anyways, interesting. According to the regulations for women, for thus were the days of their preparation a portion, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Verse 13, thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. So that's kind of a noteworthy thing. They could take whatever they wanted, whatever kind of bag that matches their shoes, whatever it was, in order to go in. Basically, the idea dressed to impress in order that they could become the queen. Verse 14, in the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of this other guy, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. So this really is basically the outline of the procedure that everyone was going to do, Esther included, but this was just what they had to do in order to go through being one of the virgins to come and see the king, in order to have a chance of being the queen. And again, man, 12 months of preparation, that's just crazy. But the Persians were known historically for being about perfumes and perfuming and being concerned with how they smelled. I don't know if the hot desert had anything to do with that, but it sure could have. But they would take care. They would do soaking in oils and baths and trying to get soft, vibrant skin, all these things. And so they would then they would go in, and it's noted there. I mean, I don't really like this, but it's just the Bible being what the Bible is. It's being really very honest. They would go in there in the evening, and they would leave in the morning. So it's assumed that they, according to the Old Testament, that they knew one another, if you know what I mean. So it's kind of a crazy thing. But this is what happened, and then they'd have to go and be with the concubines. And another kind of noteworthy thing from some commentaries, they said, and after that, if they weren't chosen, if they were one of the, maybe if it was 400, the 399 that weren't chosen, this was their life. They were the concubine of the king. Because they weren't virgins anymore, they all stayed in the king's quarters of the women, so to speak, and were a concubine of the king, probably with little or no contact with him or anyone else, really. So kind of a sad thing. Man, so the stakes are pretty high. Verse 15, now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the woman, advised. So she had her chance to get the purse that matched the shoes. And she was, again, I just note this as humility. She didn't go try to say, I know how to impress the king. She said, I'll do whatever you advise. And she did it. And Esther, it says there, obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. And so Esther was taken to King Assuras into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. And so he sent the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants. And he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. And verses 19 and 20, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. And now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. So we got another sort of interesting thing. First of all, how amazing is it that she is the one? I don't know if it's amazing or not. I'm sure she was probably freaked out, right? It was probably a scary thing. This king who just put out his other wife, his last wife, and now you're stepping into this. But God had given her favor. Doesn't say God, but she had favor in the sight of everyone who saw her and the king. Again, it's one of those things where we kind of step back from the picture and we can see God just putting her in a place for a reason. We're going to get to that in the future. And then we also see verse 19. And also in verse 21, in those days while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, we see here in 19 and 21 that Mordecai had some sort of prominent place, some sort of kind of a leadership position. We know that sitting in the gate of a city usually meant you were an elder of the city and people would be judged there. And it seems like he's being allowed, this Jewish man is being allowed to have some sort of position within the king's gate. So that's a place of prominence. So verse 21, and in those days, the last little scene that's set for us this evening, in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Assuras. And so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both of them were hanged on gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles of the presence of the king. So here's another one of those. It's just like the first little step of Mordecai getting into the picture a little bit more and becoming a little bit more of a trusted individual. He's building trust, and he's building a reputation with the king of being an honest individual that's not going to take advantage of a situation, but that is going to just be truthful in whatever comes down the road, whatever happens right in front of him. So, and this is something that I think of when I think of Mordecai and what he does here and how he's honest and he's building trust and he's building a relationship. I think, this is something that we should be doing in our lives, letting people around us know by our actions, by our integrity, that we're people of God, that we're children of the King. There should be a difference in those small areas where we could maybe turn a blind eye to say, no, I'm going to take a stand for something. And so that thus sets the scene now. Next week, the plot thickens, and we're going to see some more things happen. But we're done tonight, so we can all stand up, stretch just a little bit, say a prayer, get the kids home, get them into bed, get ready for school, all of those things. So let's pray. God, we come before you tonight, and Lord, I pray that you would, open our eyes, God, to all of the blessings and all the benefits and all the times that you intervene and you step into our life. Lord, sometimes to save us from destruction from our own hand. God, sometimes to intervene in some sort of accident that could have happened. And whatever it is, Lord, that you have been there all along, every step. And God, that we would honor you. We would seek to, like Mordecai, like Esther, we would seek to honor you. And Lord, I just thank you for that. And one of the things that I absolutely love about Esther is it seems that though she is the most beautiful, she's humble. And what an awesome thing. God, I pray that you keep us humble. I pray that you'd keep us, Lord, just walking true before you, God, that we would be a light, we would be a witness wherever we go. So I pray that you bless your people tonight as we go out. God, that your hand would be upon us, Lord, that you would keep us as we go, and Lord, that we would be a light for you. In Jesus' name, amen.